John Brown is a figure of stark contradictions, often labeled the first modern terrorist in American history, yet simultaneously revered by his supporters as a righteous freedom fighter. He was, above all, an uncompromising abolitionist, a man whose belief in the inevitability of a great and terrible war against the institution of slavery bordered on religious obsession. The man who arrived in Virginia in October 1859 was not an impromptu rebel, but a calculated and prepared ideologue. His conviction was not born of sudden passion, but forged over years of study and violent conflict. Long before he conceived of the raid on Harpers Ferry, Brown had dedicated himself to the craft of war. He meticulously studied military science, focusing on the tactics of guerrilla warfare in mountainous terrain, drawing direct inspiration from the successful slave revolt of the Haitian Revolution. His quest for knowledge was so thorough that it led him across the Atlantic to Europe, where he examined the strategies of Napoleonic battles, seeking lessons to apply to his own impending crusade. His theoretical knowledge was brutally tested and solidified on the blood-soaked plains of Kansas. His prior experience there, leading an armed struggle against pro-slavery forces, was a pivotal chapter in his life. The violence and lawlessness of Bleeding Kansas stripped away any remaining hope he had for a peaceful resolution. It was there he became utterly convinced that the deep stain of slavery could not be cleansed from the fabric of America by politics or prayer, but only by blood. This grim conviction transformed him from a mere opponent of slavery into an avenging prophet of righteous violence. He no longer saw a path for reform, he saw only the necessity of war. He came to believe that it was his divine purpose to initiate this conflict, to strike the first blow that would awaken a slumbering nation to the moral crisis it faced. This fusion of zealous idealism and methodical preparation made him a uniquely dangerous figure. He was a man who possessed both a cause he was willing to die for and the practical skills he believed were necessary to advance it. His apocalyptic worldview is perfectly captured in a letter he penned, a chilling testament to his state of mind. It reveals a man who had looked into the future and accepted, even welcomed, its violent necessities. In his own words, he laid bare the philosophy that drove him toward Harper's Ferry and his ultimate fate. I, John Brown, am now quite certain that the crimes of this guilty land will never be purged away but with blood. I had, as I now think, vainly flattered myself that without very much bloodshed it might be done. With his convictions hardened into a singular, violent purpose, John Brown moved from the realm of ideology to that of intricate and clandestine action. The rebellion he envisioned required more than just a leader, it needed soldiers, funds, and a framework for the new world he intended to build on the ashes of the old. In the stark and isolating winter of 1857–58, the plains of Iowa became the secret crucible where the physical form of his rebellion was forged. There, Brown and his most trusted lieutenants gathered a small company of young, zealous men, each one vetted for his unwavering dedication to the cause of an armed anti-slavery insurrection. This was the nascent army he would lead into Virginia. An army, however, cannot move without resources. The crucial financial backing for Brown's ambitious plan came from a clandestine group of influential and wealthy Northern abolitionists known as the Secret Six. This committee, operating in the shadows, shared Brown's belief that decades of political compromise and moral persuasion had failed. They were convinced that only armed struggle could truly eradicate the institution of slavery and were willing to fund the man they saw as the instrument of that struggle. Their support provided the essential capital for weapons, supplies, and the logistics of a secret war, transforming Brown's fanatical dream into a tangible and dangerous enterprise. It was in the summer of 1858, however, that the true scope of Brown's ambitions became breathtakingly clear. In an event that is often overlooked in historical accounts but reveals the depth of his revolutionary vision, Brown and his followers convened in the Canadian town of Chatham. The choice of location was deeply symbolic. A third of Chatham's residents were free African Americans, many of them former slaves who had escaped to freedom. Here, on friendly soil and among the people he sought to liberate, Brown and his associates declared themselves the Provisional Constitutional Convention of the People of the United States. This was not merely a meeting of conspirators, it was the founding act of a government in waiting. The convention formally adopted its own constitution, a radical document designed to govern the nation that would rise after the slave power was broken. Its preamble set a defiant and uncompromising tone, declaring that slavery was nothing other than an undeclared and barbarous war of one part of the country against another. This framing was critical, as it legally and morally justified their subsequent actions not as treason, but as a legitimate military response in an ongoing war. The convention then proceeded to establish a full government structure. In a move of profound symbolic importance, a black man named Elder Monroe was elected as its president. Other official posts were filled, creating the complete apparatus of a new, fictitious United States. John Brown, in turn, was formally proclaimed the commander-in-chief of its army. This was not the erratic outburst of a fanatic, it was a deliberate and calculated attempt to create an alternative state, a government of liberation intended to wholly replace the slaveholding United States of America. The period of abstract planning and revolutionary government building came to an end in the late spring of 1859. With the arrival of May's end, the theoretical phase of John Brown's war transitioned into its dangerous, operational reality. He materialized in Virginia, not as a famous abolitionist firebrand, but under the mundane and unassuming alias of Isaac Smith. This new identity was his shield, allowing him to move unnoticed as he laid the final, critical groundwork for his insurrection. His first move was to secure a base of operations. He rented a farm in Maryland, a location chosen with strategic precision, situated approximately 5 miles from his primary target, the town of Harpers Ferry, Virginia. This farm became the quiet, deceptive nerve center for the coming raid, a place where men and munitions could be gathered in secrecy. While Brown established his physical presence near the objective, a crucial and parallel logistical operation was set in motion. 3 of his most trusted operatives established themselves in the Pennsylvanian town of Chambersburg. From this hub, they orchestrated a covert supply chain. The considerable cache of weapons and ammunition that Brown had accumulated since his violent campaigns in Kansas was painstakingly moved southward. This was not a simple transport, it was a clandestine mission, with the tools of war being funneled along hidden trails and secret paths to the rented Maryland farm, beyond the gaze of suspicious authorities. Every rifle and every box of cartridges brought them one step closer to launching the attack. The selection of Harpers Ferry as the flashpoint for the rebellion was anything but random. It was the linchpin of Brown's entire military strategy. The town was renowned not for its size or population, but for being the site of a massive federal arsenal, one of the most significant weapon repositories in the entire country. Brown's plan was audacious and simple, to seize this vast store of arms. He believed that by capturing the arsenal, he could equip an army of liberated slaves. He specifically targeted Virginia, the largest slaveholding state, hoping that news of a successful seizure would act as a clarion call, drawing enslaved people from across Virginia and its neighboring states to his banner, sparking a firestorm of rebellion that would spread unstoppably across the South. By early October, all the pieces were in place. On October 10, 1859, from his provisional headquarters, John Brown issued the document that formally commenced his war. Titled General Order No. 1, it was a declaration of hostilities against the United States. Acting in his self-appointed role as Commander-in-Chief of the Provisional Army of Harpers Ferry, he announced that the fight had begun. The headquarters for his army was established in a Maryland schoolhouse, a small, unassuming building to which all the secretly transported supplies had been carefully relocated. The final preparations were complete. From this makeshift command post, Brown and his small band of followers were poised to strike their blow against the nation. The quiet darkness of the night of October 16 was the cloak for John Brown's long-awaited Holy War. Under its cover, his small, determined force made its move. The striking party consisted of just over 20 insurgents, 15 white men, a group that included Brown himself and 3 of his sons, and 5 black men. They crossed the Potomac River, leaving Maryland behind and stepping onto the soil of Virginia. Their initial objectives were seized with stunning ease. The guard on the crucial railroad bridge was quickly disarmed, and the federal arsenal, the grand prize of the entire operation and a symbol of national military power, fell almost without resistance, its single sentry swiftly overcome. With the heart of the town in his hands, Brown moved his command post into the captured arsenal. From this new headquarters, he dispatched his fighters to execute the next phase of the plan. They spread out into the surrounding area with specific missions. They severed the telegraph wires, a critical move designed to isolate Harpers Ferry and delay the inevitable arrival of government reinforcements. Other detachments conducted raids on nearby farms, confiscating horses and wagons needed for mobility and hauling weapons. Crucially, They also began rounding up enslaved people from these properties, attempting to arm them and transform them into the vanguard of a massive slave uprising. However, in the midst of these methodical actions, Brown made a critical, almost absurdly tragic error. He personally led an effort to halt and seize a passenger train bound for Baltimore. During the ensuing incident, a black baggage handler from the train's crew was shot and killed. This act of violence was not just a tragedy, but a fatal miscalculation. Brown compounded the mistake by detaining the train for a full 5 hours, a delay that completely unraveled his strategic timeline. The very train he had stopped became his messenger of doom. Once released, it carried the news of the raid down the line, and by noon on October 17, the authorities in Washington, D.C., were fully alerted to the insurrection at Harpers Ferry. In the very first hours of his rebellion, Brown had squandered the insurgents' most vital weapon, the element of surprise. Following this disastrous encounter, Brown retreated to the Arsenal complex, but he did not return empty-handed. He brought with him approximately 40 residents of Harpers Ferry, taken captive during the night's operations. These prisoners were not merely a liability, they were now a key part of his defensive strategy. These men would become his living shield. Imagine the scene inside the captured arsenal in the first light of dawn on October 17. Brown, a gaunt, 59-year-old abolitionist with an intense, burning gaze, strides through the buildings, inspecting the makeshift fortifications. His young supporters, many of whom possessed only an imagined experience of combat until the night before, nervously check their weapons, the reality of their situation beginning to set in. Outside, an awkward and fearful silence has fallen over the streets of Harpers Ferry as the townspeople slowly realize that something strange, violent, and deeply dangerous has descended upon them. The critical advantage of surprise, squandered by the detained train, evaporated with the morning light. Word of the insurrection spread with the speed of the telegraph, and the response from the surrounding Virginia countryside was swift and uncoordinated, yet effective. Throughout the day on October 17, hastily assembled militia units from the nearby towns of Charlestown, Shepherdstown, and Martinsburg began to converge on the scene. These citizen soldiers, while not a professional fighting force, quickly united under the command of Colonel Richard Baylor. Their primary objective was containment, and they achieved it decisively, surrounding the arsenal complex and methodically sealing off all paths of retreat for the beleaguered insurgents. Brown's raid had officially become a siege. Trapped and with the odds turning against them, the discipline among Brown's men began to fray under the immense pressure. The reality of their hopeless situation sparked panic. In a clear sign of the collapsing morale, one of the insurgents, unable to withstand the tension, made a desperate attempt to escape by leaping into the Potomac River. He was immediately spotted and shot dead by the encircling militiamen. As the day wore on, the standoff escalated into active combat. Sporadic firefights erupted throughout the day and into the evening, and the siege claimed its first victims. Gunfire from the arsenal and from the militia positions resulted in the deaths of both civilians and members of the militia. Faced with a tightening cordon and dwindling options, Brown made a critical tactical shift. He ordered 10 of his captives into the small, sturdy brick fire engine house within the arsenal grounds. This building would become his final fortress, and the prisoners his last line of defense. His orders to his remaining fighters became brutally simple, reflecting a grim acceptance of the finality of his situation. The command was categorical: they were to open fire to kill on any white person who came into their view. The hope of a widespread insurrection had been replaced by the grim determination to hold out and fight to the death, using the lives of his hostages as a shield. As evening fell on October 17, the nature of the operation to suppress the insurrection underwent a profound transformation. The containment effort, which had until then been managed by local militia, was elevated to a professional military campaign. From Washington and nearby garrisons, regular federal troops were dispatched with urgency, bringing with them the discipline and firepower of the United States Army. The command of this formidable force was entrusted to one of the Army's most respected and experienced officers, Colonel Robert E. Lee. In a moment thick with historical irony, the man tasked with crushing this violent anti-slavery rebellion was the very same individual who, less than 2 years later, would become the commanding general of the Confederate Army, fighting to defend a nation founded on slavery. Under Lee's authority were U.S. Marines, artillery, and cavalry, a force more than capable of overwhelming Brown's small band of insurgents. With the dawn of October 18, Lee, ever the methodical officer, made a final attempt to resolve the standoff without further bloodshed. He dispatched an officer under a flag of truce with a written proposal for John Brown. The terms were clear and direct: if Brown and his men would voluntarily surrender and release their hostages unharmed, the federal government would guarantee they would be spared immediate execution and taken alive. As was perhaps expected from a man who saw himself as a martyr in a holy war, Brown flatly rejected the offer. With this formal refusal, all avenues for a peaceful conclusion were closed. Colonel Lee now understood with certainty that a direct assault on the engine house was not only necessary, but inevitable. The scene at Harpers Ferry on that morning was a remarkable, if unrecognized, prelude to the coming national conflict. Among the officers serving under Lee's command were young men whose names would soon become legendary in the annals of the Confederacy. Lieutenant J.E.B. Stuart, a man who would later become the Confederacy's most celebrated cavalry commander, was present leading a detachment of horsemen. Also on the scene was Colonel Thomas Jackson, who commanded a battery of cadets from the Virginia Military Institute. Jackson, who would earn the immortal moniker, Stonewall, for his unyielding resolve in battle, had been specifically tasked with a crucial role. His cadets were to guard the captured insurgents, after the federal assault had concluded. The future leaders of the Confederacy were gathering to witness and participate in the suppression of the man whose actions would help precipitate the very war that would define their lives. On the morning of October 18, with all attempts at a negotiated surrender exhausted, the final, violent act began. The order to storm the fire engine house was given to Lieutenant Israel Green, the commander of the U.S. Marine Company. As his men charged forward, they were immediately met with what seemed to be an insurmountable obstacle: the engine house doors, heavily barricaded from the inside by the desperate insurgents. The initial assault stalled at this barrier. It was then that Colonel Robert E. Lee made a simple but brilliant tactical decision. He ordered his men to find a heavy battering ram. After a few powerful, coordinated swings, the solid doors splintered and were smashed to pieces, creating a breach. The instant the way was clear, the Marines stormed the interior. In the chaotic moments that followed, their professional training and combat experience proved decisive. The Marines moved with an almost surgical precision, their primary goal being to neutralize the hostiles while ensuring the safety of the captives. They relied on their bayonets, lunging and thrusting to methodically cut down anyone offering resistance. The small building became a terrible scene of swift, lethal violence as the insurgents fell one after another under the disciplined assault. Amid the mayhem, the terrified hostages were successfully freed, unharmed. In the final moments of the melee, John Brown was struck down, but crucially, he was not killed. He was wounded, and the Marines captured him alive. As they took him into custody, the sight was a study in contrasts. Fanaticism still burned in his eyes, but his body was utterly exhausted by the tension, the lack of sleep, and the pain of his injuries. The fight for the engine house was over. Simultaneously, as the infantry assault was underway, the cavalry under the command of Lieutenant J.E.B. Stuart galloped into action. Their mission was to secure the Kennedy Farm, the staging ground where Brown had stored the bulk of his arsenal. The operation was a success, and all of the remaining weapons and ammunition were confiscated, severing the last logistical thread of the failed rebellion. The final tally for the 2 days of conflict, October 16 to 18, was grim. Insurgents killed, 10, 8 white, including 2 of Brown's sons, and 2 black. Defenders killed, 4, including the town's mayor, Fontaine Beckham, and 1 U.S. Marine. Other civilians killed, 1, the black train porter from the initial incident. Total fatalities, approximately 17 people. Captured, John Brown and his surviving followers. Escaped, 5, including one of Brown's sons. In his official report, Colonel Robert E. Lee summarized the event with military finality, offering an assessment that captured the utter failure of Brown's vision. Brown professes that his object was to liberate all the slaves in Virginia and the whole South, and acknowledges that he has been disappointed in his expectations of assistance from the black as well as the white population of both the northern and southern states. The Negroes, whom he forced from all the neighborhood, as far as his party went, have been separated from him, and are free to go to their homes. Not a single slave who was taken by him would voluntarily take up arms, and they all went home as soon as they were released. The result proves that the plan was the creation of a fanatic and a madman. The military defeat at the arsenal was absolute, but the true collapse of John Brown's vision was more profound and, for him, more devastating. It was a blow to the very soul of his crusade. He had staked everything on a single, unwavering conviction, that the enslaved population of Virginia, hearing of his seizure of a federal arsenal, would rise up in a massive, spontaneous rebellion. He had envisioned thousands flocking to his banner, eager to take up the arms he had secured for them. But the uprising never came. The slaves of Virginia did not respond. This near-total lack of support was the raid's most fundamental failure. Even the few enslaved men whom Brown's party had forcibly taken from nearby farms and attempted to arm did not become the revolutionary soldiers he had imagined. Presented with weapons and a call to arms, most soon scattered and returned to their homes, correctly assessing the situation as hopeless. The great conflagration Brown had meant to ignite sputtered and died before it could even begin. The pressing question was, why? Several interlocking factors explain the failure of his call to resonate. First, in the isolated and controlled environment of the rural South in 1859, most slaves simply did not know the raid was happening. Information was a carefully guarded commodity, and news did not travel freely to those in bondage. For those who did hear whispers of the events at Harpers Ferry, the overwhelming emotion was not hope, but a rational and deeply ingrained fear. They were acutely aware of the brutal reprisals and collective punishments that inevitably followed any failed revolt, and the sight of local militias and federal troops converging on the town would have served as a terrifying confirmation that this effort, too, was doomed. Furthermore, Brown's preparations had been too rushed and too secretive. He was an outsider who lacked a wide, established network of contacts within the enslaved community. He had not laid the necessary groundwork to build trust or coordinate a large-scale action. Finally, there was the practical matter of experience. Even when handed a rifle, most enslaved people had no military training and were rightfully terrified at the prospect of facing the disciplined and well-armed United States Army. The psychological foundation of Brown's strategy was also deeply flawed. He had modeled his plan on the successful Haitian Revolution, but he failed to grasp the critical differences in context. In Haiti, the enslaved rose up in a French colony, an island from which they could escape into the remote and defensible mountains to wage a prolonged guerrilla war. In Virginia, they were in a sovereign state within a powerful nation. There were no mountains to escape to, every road was patrolled, and every runaway would be hunted, easily caught, and returned to his master. In the end, the cold calculus of survival proved more powerful than the appeal of a desperate rebellion. Fear was stronger than hope. In the South, this failure was interpreted through a lens of paranoia. A powerful rumor began to circulate that Brown was merely the advance guard of a larger, well-funded Northern conspiracy designed to destroy Southern society. And in part, this was true, the Secret Six had indeed financed his operations. This fact, when discovered, cemented the Southern conviction that they were under attack not by a lone fanatic, but by the North itself. The military conflict was over, but the ideological battle for John Brown's legacy was just beginning. On October 27, 1859, a wounded Brown was brought before Judge Richard Parker to stand trial. The proceedings, which lasted a swift 5 days, were charged with national significance. The accusations leveled against him were the most serious imaginable: treason against the state of Virginia, the murder of white men, and inciting a slave insurrection. Brown's defense team, led by lawyers George Hoyt and Hiram Griswold, constructed their arguments on precise legal grounds. They contended, firstly, that Brown could not be guilty of treason against a state to which he had never sworn an oath of allegiance. Secondly, they argued that he had not personally killed anyone during the raid. Finally, they asserted that the charge of inciting a rebellion was invalid, as the operation was so brief and unsuccessful that no actual insurrection had materialized. The court, however, was not swayed. On November 2, 1859, John Brown was found guilty on all counts and sentenced to death by hanging. An immediate appeal was denied. In a sign of the affair's escalating political stakes, a cassation appeal was financed by influential Northern politicians, including William Seward, the man who would soon become President Lincoln's Secretary of State. This involvement became a subject of its own special investigation in the U.S. Congress, highlighting the deepening chasm between the North and South. The date for the execution was set for December 2, 1859. It was during his final month in a jail cell that the most remarkable transformation occurred. In the court of public opinion across the North, the convicted criminal began to evolve into a righteous martyr. The state's decision to allow Brown to conduct extensive correspondence from his death row cell played a decisive role in this metamorphosis. Each letter he wrote was a carefully crafted testament to his cause, and they were eagerly published in Northern newspapers. Through his powerful and lucid prose, Brown projected an image of a morally unshakable and serenely courageous man facing death for his convictions. His words became his final, most effective weapon. A phrase from the last letter he wrote, penned on the very day of his execution, would soon be known across the world, copied and reprinted in countless newspapers, becoming the definitive epitaph of his mission. I, John Brown, am now quite certain that the crimes of this guilty land will never be purged away but with blood. Even in his final moments, Brown seized every opportunity to make a stand. When offered a final confession, the offer came with a condition: he would have to confess to a pro-slavery clergyman from Virginia. Brown proudly refused. He declared he could not, in good conscience, be ministered to by a man who endorsed the very institution he considered a mortal sin. It was his last act of defiance, a final, deeply personal political statement. The morning of December 2, 1859, was cold and clear. At 11 o'clock, John Brown was led from his cell to the gallows. The execution was a major state event, conducted with the solemnity of a military operation. Fearing a last-minute rescue attempt by Northern abolitionists, Virginia's Governor Henry Wise had taken extreme precautions, dispatching a force of 1,000 soldiers to secure the town. This security detail included the Corps of Cadets from the Virginia Military Institute, commanded by Colonel Francis Smith, turning the execution site into an armed camp. Among the witnesses to the event was Colonel Thomas Jackson, who would later be known as Stonewall. He recorded his observations of Brown's final moments, a description that captured the quiet dignity of the condemned man and the profound unease of the observer. He behaved with unflinching firmness. I was very much agitated by the thought that before me stood a man in full health, who in a few moments would enter eternity. I sent up a petition that he might be saved. The very thought that in a minute he would die seemed to me awful. I hoped that he was prepared to die, although it is doubtful. Imagine the silhouette of the 59-year-old man on the scaffold, surrounded by a sea of armed guards. His face, gaunt and worn from a month of awaiting his fate, still reflected the unwavering conviction of his cause. The rope was tightened. The noose was fitted over his neck. And then, a profound silence fell. It was the end. But in the very moment that John Brown's life was extinguished in Virginia, his legend was born across the North. As he died. In the North, church bells began to toll in towns and cities. Cannons and guns fired for a full minute in solemn salute. In pulpits, preachers began to deliver sermons on his life, casting him as a righteous man. The abolitionist cause had found its holy martyr. In the South, the execution was intended to be a stern message about the consequences of insurrection. Instead, it further inflamed Northern sentiment against the South. While Southerners officially branded Brown a terrorist, his eloquent words from prison and his stoic conduct at his trial and execution had transformed him into a hero in the eyes of a rapidly growing number of Northerners. The chasm between the two halves of the country had become a grave. John Brown's physical body was gone, but his spirit was immediately resurrected in the culture of the North. The transformation of his image from a reviled fanatic into a celebrated hero of the Union cause was astonishingly swift, driven by the power of art and ideology. The most potent vehicle for this legend appeared almost immediately. By the end of December 1859, a new song began to be heard in the northern states, a simple tune with hauntingly powerful lyrics. John Brown's body lies amoldering in the grave, but his soul goes marching on. This song quickly became an anthem. It was sung with solemn fervor at abolitionist rallies, its verses spreading like wildfire and embedding Brown's sacrifice into the popular consciousness. Later, as the nation plunged into civil war, this simple folk tune would be transformed into a powerful and thunderous battle march for the Union Army. This cultural canonization was championed by the intellectual and literary elite of the North. The influential writer and philosopher Henry David Thoreau, a leading voice of transcendentalism, organized a large and well-attended public meeting to eulogize the executed abolitionist. In his address, Thoreau made a bold and shocking declaration, stating that Brown and the men who had followed him to their deaths were, in fact, the best of people. His endorsement, and laudatory articles from other supporters that began to flood Northern publications, helped solidify a new narrative. Brown was not a madman, but a man of supreme moral clarity who had acted decisively while others had merely talked. In a moment of dark historical irony, there was another figure present at Brown's execution whose life would also be defined by political violence. Among the witnesses in the crowd was a young actor named John Wilkes Booth, the man who would one day assassinate President Abraham Lincoln. The spectacle of the state-sanctioned execution of a political rebel appears to have made a profound impression on Booth, reinforcing his own conviction that violence was a necessary and legitimate tool for achieving political ends. The legend forged in the weeks after Brown's death soon became a tangible force in history. Not even a year and a half had passed before the nation was at war. As hundreds of thousands of Northern farmers and workers marched south, they did so to the resounding chorus of the song about John Brown. They went to war for the Union, but they were animated by the spirit of the man who had been willing to sacrifice his own life for the very same cause. His soul was, indeed, marching on. In the grand narrative of American history, the raid on Harpers Ferry is recorded as far more than a failed insurrection. It was the general rehearsal for the Civil War. The events of October 1859 served as a violent and undeniable demonstration of how deep the schism between the North and South had become. It laid bare the raw animosity simmering beneath the surface of political discourse and proved that both sides were now willing to embrace extreme measures to defend their opposing worlds. The point of compromise had passed. The impact in the South was immediate and seismic, manifesting as a wave of collective paranoia. The raid was not seen as the act of an isolated fanatic, but as the first blow in a coordinated war being waged by the North. Slaveholders began to see conspiracies everywhere, and a profound sense of existential dread settled over the region. This fear translated into urgent demands for greater security, the strengthening and arming of local militias, and the implementation of stricter controls over the enslaved population. Every Northerner traveling in the South was now viewed with suspicion, as a potential abolitionist agent or a conspirator in a future plot. Conversely, the effect in the North was to harden anti-slavery sentiment and push many toward a more radical position. The number of Northerners who supported a complete and final break with the South grew exponentially. John Brown, who just 6 months earlier had been dismissed by many in the North as a crazed and dangerous zealot, was now widely revered as a hero and a symbol of righteous justice. His actions, once seen as reckless, were now reinterpreted as a necessary and noble sacrifice. This escalating tension was fueled by a storm of rumors and propaganda that swept across both regions, each side constructing a narrative that cast the other as a monstrous villain. In the South, wild stories spread that Brown was merely the advance guard of a much larger, more comprehensive Northern plan and that thousands more armed abolitionists would soon descend upon them. In the North, newspapers and pamphlets circulated lurid accounts of the South's brutal repression in the aftermath of the raid, detailing alleged tortures and summary executions that deepened the moral outrage against the slaveholding states. The nation was a powder keg, and the election of November 1860 provided the spark. The victory of Abraham Lincoln, a candidate who, while not calling for the immediate abolition of slavery, was firmly opposed to its expansion, was viewed by the paranoid South as the final, intolerable provocation. It was the confirmation of all their fears. Less than a year after John Brown's raid had exposed the nation's fatal division, the political system broke. In December 1860, South Carolina officially seceded from the Union, and a civil war began. John Brown remains one of the most polarizing and controversial figures in the whole of American history. His legacy is a study in contradiction, a permanent fixture in the nation's debate over justice, violence, and morality. For some, he will forever be a terrorist and a fanatic, a man who abandoned moral and legal boundaries in the pursuit of an obsessive vision. For others, he is a paramount hero of the struggle against slavery, a man of unwavering conviction who was willing to sacrifice everything: his sons, his reputation, and his own life for the cause of human freedom. His story is woven directly into the fabric of the conflict his actions helped to ignite. In a little-known but powerful testament to his enduring influence, years after his death, as the Union armies fought their way across the South, they did so while singing the song of John Brown. The man whose body lay, mouldering in the grave, was a constant spiritual presence on the battlefields. Every soldier in blue knew that the great and terrible war they were fighting had, in a real sense, begun when one old abolitionist dared to try and explode the slaveholding South from within. Beyond the Civil War, Brown's raid left a lasting psychological imprint on the American consciousness. It was a stark and bloody demonstration that the established order of the state could be violently disrupted by a small, desperate, and utterly determined minority. It proved that violence could, for better or worse, be a powerful instrument of political change, capable of forcing a reluctant nation to confront a moral crisis it would have preferred to ignore. This was a profound and unsettling lesson, one that the American society would absorb and which would continue to influence its internal politics and its ongoing struggle with the legacy of radical action for generations to come.